This interview was recorded on June 8th, 2021. Hi, I'm Len Epp from Lean Pub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Marco Sampellegrini. Based in Milan, Marco is a software engineering consultant who works with startups and founders on everything from product development to cloud infrastructure. You can follow him on Twitter at _alpaca with 2 extra A's at the end, and check out his website at marcosampellegrini.com. Marco is the author of the book, The Simple Haskell Handbook, Learn How to Build Haskell Applications. In the book, rather than focusing on theory or formally teaching the programming language, Marco takes readers through the process of building something practical in Haskell from scratch. In this interview, we're going to talk about Marco's background and career, professional interests, his book, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience writing and self-publishing. So thank you very much, Marco, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you first found yourself becoming interested in computers and programming and software.
Sure. So I was born in a town near Milan in Italy. And I come from a working class family, so there wasn't a lot of tech going on in my home. And one thing that I specifically missed in my teens was an internet connection. So I remember going through high school with all of my peers, chatting and, spending their times on whichever social social website was popular at the time. And I felt left out. And I felt like this great invention that was the internet was kind of not available to me. And that really felt bad. So eventually, when I was 17, we got an internet connection. And that's when I started going down the rabbit hole. And my interest wasn't specifically in programming initially. I was explicitly fascinated about the internet and the fact that we had this global worldwide network full of interesting things, but you couldn't point at exactly one place where those things lived. To me, that sounded completely crazy, and I wanted to find out more about it. So I started building little static websites with, I think it was Front Page and Dreamweaver, those kind of programs back then. And there were free website hosting back then. The one I used offered like 20 megabytes of space or something like that. And so that's where I started, publishing my first toy websites. And the thing I realized is that, static websites are cool, but I want to do dynamic stuff. I want to build a forum. I want to know, how people deal with users posting messages and users logging in and sending emails and all of that stuff. So that's what triggered my interest in programming, really. And that free web hosting offered support for PHP. So that's the language I eventually got to learn. And I loved PHP. I loved dynamic typing. I felt like I had superpowers. And it was really, really fun. So when I finished high school, it was kind of a no-brainer for me to get a job and do this kind of stuff full time. I wanted to get my hands dirty and learn as much as I could about programming. And I've done a few years in web agencies. So I would take on projects that would last maybe a month, maybe 3 months. And yeah, it was really, really fun. After that, I was kind of craving for being part of a team. So during my time in agencies, I would be the only developer on the team, or it was not common for me to share, code base with another developer or other two. So I really wanted to know what it was like to work with other people, and I wanted to learn from them as well. So that's when I started looking into startups and maybe working on a product in a more of a long-term fashion. So in agencies, projects came and went. was great because every time I could start fresh and I could apply the knowledge that I gathered from the previous project. But it also meant that, I never faced the problems that you face when you have to maintain an application for years and there is a team working on it. You're not the only person working on it. So I joined a startup. It was a pretty big startup in Milan, and it had a pretty big team. In fact, there were multiple teams within the company. And yeah, that taught me a lot. And it kind of showed me that, maybe PHP and dynamic typing isn't the end of it all. Like it became apparent to me that, it was really easy to snag bugs into production. And even if you had a lot of tests, things broke all the time anyway. And so that's when I first got, a hunch that maybe there was something to static typing. Maybe languages such as Java weren't all that bad. Up to that point, I absolutely hated stuff like Java because of the verbosity and the types. I couldn't understand why people would go through all of that added noise when you could just do the thing you wanted to do in languages such as PHP. And I could go on if this isn't too boring.
No. It's very interesting. Actually, just before you go on, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind explaining the difference between static and dynamic typing, because the non-programmers listening might think we're talking about like keyboard typing.
Sure. Yeah. So in a dynamically typed language such as PHP or JavaScript, you go about writing your code and you don't know whether it's going to work or not. Really, you can't you can't prove anything about the code you just written until you run it. So the usual workflow is that you start your application and you refresh the page or you run your test and you find out if there's anything wrong with it. Whereas with a statically typed language such as Java or Haskell, there is a compiler. So you get an extra check from a program that tells you, hey, this thing you wrote here doesn't really make sense. And it could be, a dumb error like using a string where an int should have been used. Those errors are really trivial, but it's still useful that a compiler catches them for you. But in Haskell in particular, the compiler gives you a lot of room to express your domain and your problem in a particularly explicit way. And so when you get down to modeling your domain using, union types and stuff like that, you get more guarantees about how your program is going to behave and whether it is correct or not, even before you actually run it.
It's really interesting. It sounds like there's a sort of correspondence in your path and the types of things that the kinds of programming languages that you used, because I didn't know your origin story before you just told it now, but you were very independent. It sounds like not only in your choice to be interested in the internet and in programming and things like that, but you just started creating your own web pages, and without going to university or anything like that, you just got jobs, and then those jobs were alone, and you got to be sort of got what many people would have loved to be, the privilege of doing things on your own for so long, but eventually realizing that actually maybe working with other people, or I imagine things like legacy code and things like that start to become more important. But before we go on to talk about, so now we're at the kind of like stage where you're transitioning from one thing to another. But I wanted to ask you a question. So this comes up on this podcast relatively frequently, where I sort of ask people, if you could have gone another way, would you have preferred to have gone that way on the path towards the same career? So for example, and I'm sure you get this question from time to time, do you regret not studying computer science formally in university for a few years?
Yeah, so I don't regret it. And as I said, my family wouldn't have had the means to support me in such an endeavor, which meant I would have had to get a job anyway. And at that point, I think I would have just burned out after not even a year. And most importantly, I didn't find it interesting. Like, I know this is something, I was very stubborn at the time and naive. I still am to a certain extent. And so, I thought I knew better and I could learn the stuff that I cared about on my own, or, with the help of forums and strangers on the internet. But, at some point, like, one thing I think is really, like, going to university, it really helps you if you want to move abroad, specifically in the US. At some point, I tried to get a visa. It wasn't even, a long-term staying visa. It was a 2 years, I think, kind of visa. And it got rejected specifically because the officer didn't think I had the skills needed to perform the job, which came down to not having a degree. So that was the first time I realized, maybe it would have been worth spending the 3 years or 5 years to get a computer science degree. But other than that, in the last couple of years, in the last 3 years, I'm realizing that, how helpful computer science, like, sometimes I'm lacking the foundations, I feel like. So all of the stuff that I sort of skipped over and glanced over in the beginning, it started to come out as I approached more and more complex projects. And it's not like it's a big gap. Like, I feel I can fill in the gaps as I go through. But, it would have been fairly interested to study maybe distributed systems early on in my career, or studying compilers early on in my career. One thing that, so I don't regret not going to university, and especially I don't regret it because if I went in university in Milan, I wouldn't have learned those topics anyway. They're not thought. It's not like going to MIT. So it is what it is. I overall, I don't regret it, no.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing that. It's always, I always at least find it very interesting to hear about people's decisions that they made along the way. And, of course, when you're young, what do you know? So there's always a little bit of accident to everything that happens. To hear people talk about whether or not they would have wanted to do it differently is always just really fascinating. And in a way, usually the answer is kind of like, of course not, I'd be someone else if I'd done things differently. But yeah. So anyway, there you found yourself going from being very independent all the way along. And as you said, it sounds like you learned a lot, just by getting Dreamweaver and using it and banging away and being stubborn, and then, meeting people online and forums and things like that. But so then you found yourself at this sort of, it sounds like, relatively well-funded big startup, and you had to work with teams and basically writing code that other people would be using and sharing. And so, I was wondering if you could pick up the narrative again from there.
Yeah, so I wasn't ready to give up on dynamically typed languages yet. But at that point, I started to have a feeling that maybe there was something to statically typed languages. With that being said, I switched off from PHP, but I landed on JavaScript. So it was pretty much the same deal in terms of typing. And that was about the time where Node.js was starting to get big and React entered the scene and was becoming big as well. And again, using React and Redux in particular, again, I was confronted with themes and concepts that I sort of heard through over the years, but I didn't really investigate, like immutability, or the fact that in Redux you have to have a single source of truth. So all the flow of your application must go through a funnel, if you like, and all of the state is centralized in a single place. And that was a way of thinking about my application that I never had before. It didn't occur to me that you could model things this way, and it didn't occur to me that you could do useful stuff with an immutable language, which JavaScript obviously is not. So these all felt like playing with a toy, but not getting the actual good stuff. And so, if you add that to the statically typed thoughts that I had before, I started to really looking for a language that could, check all of those boxes. And Haskell came up, and I couldn't understand any of it. Like, it was full of strange stuff, strange operators, and greater than equals signs everywhere. Didn't make any sense. And even reading a few pages of tutorials or blog posts, they were full of terms I never heard of. And so I felt really dumb at that point, but I wasn't ready to give up. And fortunately, I came upon Elm, which is the language that inspired Redux, I think. So it was sort of related to the React word. And Elm clicked. Like, Elm was really terse. It was really simple. It didn't have all of the big terms that I read about when looking into Haskell. And it was a slow process, but I managed to pick it up. And I felt like that was a really great choice. And it was great to deal with. Like, it was great to finally experience what it meant to work with a language with these kind of features. And so I managed to land an Elm job. I would do Elm most of the time and a little bit of Elixir as well. And I was kind of the person that knew Elm better in the company. This was a company that was really willing to bet on Elm and Elixir as well, but I was interested in the Elm part. And so we started building a lot of applications with it. We started to become more proficient with it and to understand more about static typing and how to model our domain correctly. And all the while, I kept an eye on Haskell. I wasn't willing to give up on it. And, I picked up some books, and slowly but surely, I finally, could understand a little bit of it and write little programs with it. And, as long as I kept my programs looking more like Elm that they did Haskell, they seemed to work properly, and I seemed to be able to understand them. And so after this experience with Elm, I wanted to sort of replicate it with Haskell. So, I would just get a job where I get to write Haskell full time, and I'm sure I can get better at it. So I moved to London and worked for Habito for a couple of years. And that's where, my brain really exploded. That's where I managed to learn a ton about functional programming and Haskell and all the math behind it as well. That's something that I ignored completely up to that point. And yeah, I met some exceptional people. I went to conferences. It was really, really great.
Thanks very much for that. It's funny. Longtime listeners of the show are going to know that my next question is going to be kind of selfish, and it's going to be, where did you live when you were in London? I lived there for a few years myself, and I lived in a few different neighborhoods. And one time I actually had a guest on who was at that very moment living in the first neighborhood I lived in when I moved to London in Balham. So yeah, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind taking a moment talking about that, because that's something that actually quite a few people who've been on the podcast have had that experience of moving from somewhere to London.
Yeah, so my neighborhood of choice in London is Wapping, which is just next to Tower Bridge. And I love it. It's a very quiet area. There is a nice canal in the middle of it. And yeah, a lot of people that I met completely disliked it because there's nothing to do there. But I loved it precisely because there's nothing to do there. Like, it's quiet. There is, the nice river walk. And it was close to work. Like, I could get to work in less than 15 minutes on foot, which was great.
Yeah, ultimately, I ended up making that decision for my last job in London. Was the most important thing to me became being within, about 15 minutes walking distance. I just had too much of the Northern Line, which I gather is a lot better now than in my days. But yeah, I mean, and of course, walking in London is just a pleasure in itself.
It is.
And so that's really interesting. So you found yourself in London, and then I guess you eventually returned to Milan.
I did. So that was just before the pandemic. And you mentioned before the show that you wanted to get into this. So maybe this is a good time.
Yeah.
So it's February 2020. I hand my resignation for the job in London. And I plan to, take 6 months off, maybe travel South America and take some time for myself. I still have my apartment in London until the end of February. So my plan was to come back home in Milan for a bit and then, depart to wherever I decided to go. But, I come back at the end of February and some big family issue comes up, which means I wouldn't be able to live soon because I have to take care of this. But also, a week later, 10 days later, at the beginning of March, Lombardy, my region here in Italy, gets the worst outbreak after, what happened in China. And so it was really crazy. Like, I was pumped to live. And I was pumped to, take some time for myself and travel around and backpacking and, be done with technology for a while. But, I seem to have left just before all of these broke off. And so, yeah,
So you would have been like severely locked down for quite some time.
Yeah, exactly. So Milan wasn't in great shape, especially during the first lockdown. And, I think as developers, we have, and I'm talking to the developers in the audience, maybe there are other people as well, for sure. But as developers, we're quite accustomed to being in a closed space, in a closed environment for hours on end. So it didn't affect me too much. And, I could still walk outside because as I said, I'm not exactly in Milan. I'm in a small town near it. So there wasn't exactly, police going door to door, making sure that you wouldn't go out. And so the occasional walk around was allowed here because there's nobody to get in contact with. But yeah, it was tough. And it was tough seeing other people, being affected drastically by this. And yeah, but somehow now the situation is pretty good, as it is in a lot of countries around the world. We're getting our shot, like our job of vaccine, and restaurants have opened up. I think this week gyms and cinemas have opened up as well. So yeah, there is an atmosphere of optimism for sure.
And so you suddenly found yourself with a lot of time in an enclosed space on your hands that you weren't expecting. What did you end up doing with your time?
Yeah, I almost forgot to mention, Yeah, I ended up writing a book, and that wasn't even my initial plan. Like my initial plan was to record a screencast or some sort of video course, because I think the kind of book that I ended up writing would have been much better suited in a video format. But as a non-native speaker and as a person that hasn't never recorded anything in their life, I realized that it would have taken me, like it would actually take me 3 hours between recording and editing to produce 3 minutes of decent quality video. So that was just too much effort for me. And at one point I thought, well, maybe if I have a script that I could follow, then the process would shorten a bit. It would be easier to record these videos. So I started writing the script for my videos and including, the snippets of code that I would have to write in the live coding recording session. And that didn't really help. Like it still took me forever to record short bits of video. But looking at the script, and reading it through it, I realized that, this could work on its own. Maybe if I package it nicely and I format it nicely, it could be its own thing. And I also really enjoyed, writing it. I enjoyed writing the script much more than reading it out loud and typing out the stuff that I wrote. And so the script became really the book. It was the seed for what became the book. And I'm really glad I spent that time working on a personal project. It was in the past few years, I had in the back of my mind that I wanted to produce something that I could call my own. Like I wanted to work on my own product, be it that a software as a service business or an actual product like a book or a video course. I wanted to make something of my own. So I'm really glad, in a sense, that the pandemic forced me in front of a screen and allowed me to complete this project.
Yeah, that's such an amazing and interesting story. It's funny. In the publishing world, there's been this phenomenon of COVID books, basically not about the pandemic, but as a result of it, and to the point where like even more than usual, publishers are like, enough. We've got enough submissions and stuff like that. But it does take a lot of time to do a book, and it does. Just to talk for a moment about videos. That's actually come up on this podcast in the past because so many of our guests are content creators themselves. And definitely it can take 3 hours to produce 3 minutes of good video. People do talk about, if you want to produce an hour long thing, you might want to have, a week, available to do that, especially if you're doing your own editing and all that kind of stuff. And in particular, another issue with videos is editing them later on if something changes, and it's really kind of impossible because recreating the space you were in, the moment you were in, if you're recording yourself, what you look like, things like that. If all of a sudden for 30 seconds you're tanned and it's echoey, and people can tell that you spliced it in. And so like, although videos are amazing resources for training and things like that, they really are a ton of work. I think it's funny, a lot of people will probably be like, well, book doesn't sound so easy either. And it's not, but it is definitely the case that, editing a typo in a book or changing a sentence in a paragraph is a lot easier than doing it in a video. And so, moving on to the subject of your book, Simple Haskell. So just before we dive into the book itself and the concept of Simple Haskell, which actually is a concept unto itself, it doesn't just mean like Simple Haskell, literally. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what Haskell is. I believe I watched a couple of talks that you gave preparing for this, and I've had a few, Haskellers on in the past, but you talk about how Haskell was designed for 3 purposes. One was to teach functional programming. One was to experiment with basically computer science concepts, and the other one was to build things.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about its history and what and then move into what your concept of simple Haskell is.
Sure. So first of all, Haskell is a fairly old programming language compared to other mainstream languages. Like it is, I think, 31 years old this year. And so it is sort of natural for it to have accumulated a ton of stuff just because it has existed for this long. But yeah, it was born in an academia setting, and its purpose was to, as you said, teach functional programming to students, but also to advance the state of the art in language research. So it was really meant to be used as a tool or as a playground for language researchers to explore new avenues and come up with new ideas and new techniques in the programming language space, which meant that the compiler, is really a very complicated beast because of this. Because, when a researcher or somebody is doing their PhD dissertation, they would hack on the compiler and add their own extension to suit their needs, to introduce this new novel concept that they're working on or that they're studying, so that the compiler can be able to understand it and work with it. But even before going there, so Haskell is kind of unique in terms of programming languages because it's pure and lazy. And we don't necessarily have to get into what that means, but you sort of have to rewire your brain a bit in order to use it if you're accustomed to traditional programming languages. So it's functional opposed to object-oriented, which most other programming languages are. And it's lazy in the sense that when you tell it to do something, it won't do it. Like it will refuse to do anything until it is strictly necessary for it to do it. And this comes with great benefits in terms of being able to express, things such as infinite lists, which can't exist in traditional languages because we don't have infinite memory. And so a traditional programming language would just go out of memory if given an infinite list. But it also comes with its set of problems because it is sometimes difficult to predict how a Haskell program is going to behave performance-wise. And you often hear people complaining about space leaks, which means you were expecting this tiny little program to use a constant amount of memory, and instead it's growing exponentially for some unknown reason. So yeah, Haskell is very old. It's more than 30 years old and has been used successfully by language researchers. But at some point through its history, it also has picked up interest in the industry. So people that built real-world applications wanted to use it to build their software. And it is kind of amazing that it managed to serve both crowds equally well. So language researchers haven't stopped using it to push the envelope forward, and the industry hasn't stopped either. So more and more companies are getting on board and using Haskell in one way or another, and this is great. Except that, as I was saying in the beginning, we have a very complex beast in our hands. So it might seem like you have to know everything. You have to know all of the extensions that are in the compiler, even though some of them haven't been touched for 10 years or maybe have been introduced 15 years ago and then never to be spoken again. But they're there. And as a beginner, you don't know whether they're going to be useful to you or not. And the other issue with extensions is that it's very difficult to predict how they're going to interact with one another. And so you can pick and choose which extensions you want to enable in your program, but you might have, bad surprises because the compiler is going to break in ways, not pleasant ways, let's just say that. So you will come up with errors that are not really helpful and nasty stuff like that. So my aim with simple Haskell was to say, look, if you're a beginner or an intermediate developer looking into Haskell, there's only a subset of core stuff and features that you have to care about. If you want to use other stuff, that's fine. Like you can read about it on your own, and it's all good. If you understand it, then by all means bring it in and use it. But if you have no clue where to start, this is the core set of features that I think is very productive, and I think can be a good jumping point for teams that have little experience with functional programming to start using Haskell successfully.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting thing. Convincing a team to take up a new language is a very difficult thing because there's so much risk involved, right? It's not just in fact, most programmers would probably enjoy the challenge and oh wow, isn't that great? I get to learn something new and it's going to make me a better programmer. But there's often someone sitting on top of it with a responsibility to deliver, and you have to explain to them, there's going to be a bit of a lag in our productivity while we take this on, and then actually we're steering our ship in a totally new direction software wise, and that can be a really big challenge. And being able to explain not only how Haskell is going to be beneficial, but how you're going to be able to train people up in it is really important.
Exactly. And this goes both ways. Like one big part of my argument was actually, I was actually arguing for the opposite. Like I think in a lot of Haskell applications, we see a lot of complex code and fancy types. I like to call them that because they're fancy and they make you look smart, but they don't necessarily bring a lot of benefits to the application. And this is subjective, and a lot of people will hate me for saying this. But, a big part of my argument is that these advanced features are giving you only marginal benefits compared to the simpler version of the same program. But they're actually building up a huge wall between you and the rest of the team, because you might be able to understand that stuff, but you're cutting off, the junior developer or even the experienced developer that has years of experience in another language, but couldn't translate that in Haskell because, you have decided to buy into all of these advanced features.
Well, and you're also presumably locking in the company you're working for, assuming you're working for a company, to only being able to hire people with that level
exactly
of understanding going forward once you've designed it, and which isn't, as you say, there's a bit of subjectivity to it. That's not necessarily proof that you shouldn't go down that path, but that you should understand that there's a cost to adopting what you call fancy types and being aware of what that is. That reminds me, actually, you've got a project, I think it's your project, called Zero Bullshit Haskell.
Yes.
Which is a bit more aggressive than saying simple Haskell. But it's funny because it reminded me actually of something. There was a philosopher named Jerry Cohen, who I happened to meet years and years ago, but he had a project called Marxism Without the Bullshit. And I don't know how familiar you are with Marxism, but basically the sort of suspicion was that what he was really after, and his fellows were after, was Marxism without the Hegel. And it just there's just a bit of a correspondence I saw between kind of getting rid of the kind of philosophy and the obscure terminology and just sort of boiling it down to, what are the actual analytical purposes for which we're, adopting this in this one ideology.
Yeah. And again, this is I think this it's important to say that this is only the first stepping stone. It's only to get your feet wet. And it's not like you can go your whole career without studying the theory and without getting into the more advanced stuff. But it's really helpful, I think, especially for a person like me. As I said, I've always been very practical, and I never had time to read big explanations and read huge chunks of documentation. Like, I wanted to be shown early on why something was the way it was and why it worked and why I needed it. And so my effort with Zero Bullshit Haskell was that, like, show me why I care. Why should I care?
Yeah, no, that's I mean, as a pedagogical approach, I couldn't agree more. And it is true that often people have a difficulty. Unfortunately, some people's mindsets just have difficulty understanding that there's things are going to be expressed differently given the stage of the intended recipient, right? And so my brother's got a joke that, when people always say, oh, that's economics 101. And it's like, well, you don't have to actually teach at a university for long before you realize that everything in 101 is a lie, because it's the first stage along the way, right? You can't give them the end result, which is everything's up in the air and contested. In 101, you're going to learn, everything works this way. We've got it figured out. Here are the simple rules, and it's like, but you have to go through. You have to
exactly.
Go through that. Typically, you have to go through that. It's just a stage along the way. And so specifically, you've written a book for people at the first stage with Simple Haskell. And this isn't necessarily people who have never programmed before or something like that, but it's people who it's like, you want to get to know Haskell? Here's step one. Read my book, if I gather correctly what your purpose was. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you structured the book and what someone can expect to gain from it if they read it.
Yeah, so the book is very hands-on, and it's based around building a sort of real-world application. So in the book, we get to build a continuous integration server, which for the non-technical people, it's something that as developers we use every day, and it's meant to, build our projects and get them from our local machine to production, if you will. And so it isn't going to be a fully fledged continuous integration server, but it's going to have quite a few features that I think are interesting, and it has a interesting architecture as well, with a client server architecture and main server and multiple agents kind of deal as well. And it's built around Docker, and it's inspired by Drone, which is a very popular CI server, and hence the name Quad as a tribute. And so what people can expect from the book, I think, is to see firsthand what it's like to think in a Haskell, to think functionally about a problem, how to model a domain in a functional way, and how you get from 0 lines of code to a working application without, involving a ton of theory and a ton of big terminology. In fact, I tried really hard to not put, crazy terms in the book, like monads and stuff like that.
Oh, even though they're not. I was timing it. It took us about 45 minutes to get to the M word in a Haskell podcast.
Yeah,
that's
so
done.
I wish I didn't say that. But yeah, those are things that you get to use, but you don't necessarily need to know you're using them to be proficient with it. It's like putting a label on a pattern that you've been using on and on again. I think it's more useful to know at an instant, deep down, you have the pattern down. You know that this is an abstraction that comes back over and over again. It's not necessarily useful to label it as a monad. That's gonna just scare you and make you realize that you don't know the actual definition of what a monad is and which laws it should abide and stuff like that. So I tried really hard to keep the theory out, and there are great books out there if you care about that stuff, and if you want to learn Haskell from first principles. Like that's the main book people refer to when somebody wants to get into Haskell. And I read it myself. It was 1,200 pages long when I got it, and it was incomplete. So maybe it is, right now it is even longer. And it's a great book. And I remember the part I liked the most in that book. It was a little section kind of in the middle of the book where the author went through building a sort of small application from scratch. So there was this little chapter building, I think it was a URL shortener. So a very tiny project, but still incredibly enlightening for somebody like me, which wanted to know, okay, now how do I use all of this stuff you've been telling me about for 600 pages? And so you can think of my book like that section expanded to a full-fledged book. I like to think that, all the theory is nailed in other books, in other resources. But then when it gets to the practical stuff, you can refer to my book to actually see the workflow and the tiny tips and tricks that a Haskell developer would use on a daily basis to build a real world application.
And just moving on to the last part of the interview where we talk about your experience, writing a book and things like that. I guess my first question would be, why did you decide to choose LeanPub as the platform to publish the book in the end?
Yeah, so I explored different options. Not sure if I'm allowed to name other competitors, similar platforms, but like
totally. Although, just the only qualification I would say is we try to be nice about everybody. So, but it's okay. Cool. It's okay to say whatever you want.
Yeah. So my initial thought was to go with Gumroad and just host the publishing on my the landing page or the book page on my website, and just have a tiny button that would go to Gumroad and have readers purchase it there. But then I sort of realized that, there's a friction in the buying process. And so I personally don't have a Gumroad account, and I personally would be at least a little bit skeptical in putting my card details in their thing, not because it's a bad service, but at least here in Europe, it's not that common to buy stuff off of it. It might be different in North America. I think it's more widespread over there. But the biggest reason is that it seemed LeanPub had a big section on Haskell books, and so I thought, most people that are going to be interested in my book probably already have a LeanPub account, and they already have their card details linked up. And so the purchase is going to be there's going to be much less friction in purchasing it. And yeah, just leveraging the network effects, I think, of a platform like LeanPub, where there seemed to be quite a lot of quality Haskell books. And I realized that it might not be the answer you were looking for. I used very few features of the platform itself, although, if I were to do it again, I would probably leverage the platform a bit more. I would collect email addresses and use the discussions forum for sure to share early drafts of the book. But I didn't use any of that. I sort of came to LeanPub with a almost finished product, and I'm glad I went with LeanPub in the end, because it turned out to be a great platform.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. One thing I should say is that, and I'm actually looking forward to asking you specifically how you created your PDF file, because that's something that, and we saved this for the end. So people who aren't interested in learning about self-publishing don't need to listen to it, but people who are interested really like to hear about the details about how people went about doing it. And your book is very nice. So curious to hear about that. One thing I should mention, though, is that we actually don't save payment details on LeanPub. So, but
I didn't notice that.
Yeah, we don't save them. But one of the advantages for existing LeanPub people with LeanPub accounts is that they've got a lot. You've got a LeanPub library, right? And so if there's a one place to go for your, at least one collection of books that you've bought. And so, maybe yours is next to, Sandy McGuire's or Chris Penner's or something like that. That's actually one of the things that is actually really handy. And the other thing is too, that LeanPub makes it really easy to update the book, regardless of whether you're using, as you mentioned, you're using our Bring Your Own Book writing flow. So you're not writing your book using LeanPub tools, you're writing it using your own tools, but you can then still easily update. You can, if it's a major update, you can send a message to anyone who's opted in to hear about major updates. We've got coupons, and you can add arbitrary digital content like code and things like that. So there are a lot of things. If you're writing a technical programming book, we've just got a lot of extra things around it. But yeah, we don't save payment details.
Yeah.
How did you make your book? Did you use Word and play around with formatting? Did you use something else?
I used Vim, which is
okay.
Yeah, for non-technical people, it's one of those weird 80s looking editors that you use from the terminal of your computer. And so my book is really a huge markdown file, which I then turn into a PDF through a set of somewhat complex phases. Like there's a lot of scripting involved. And yeah, I couldn't explain, to be honest, what the whole process was, but like there's a lot of parsing Markdown to understand what the headings are in order to create the table of content. There's a script to stitch together the different parts of the book. So the cover, the table of contents, then there's the introduction, which is a separate Markdown file for some reason. And there's yet other scripts to format the chunks of code in a nice way. There is quite a bit of CSS to render the page nicely. And then at the end, there's something that turns this giant HTML file into a PDF. And I gotta say, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. It took me quite a bit of time to nail this pipeline of glue code and scripts and put them together. Maybe it would have been wiser to just stick it into LeanPub and have you guys generate it. It would have been certainly less effort.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. It's really interesting, actually. You're not the first LeanPub author to have devised their own process. And a lot of the way LeanPub works is actually from over the years, from talking to people just about exactly kind of what you just described, and learning from authors how they solve their own problems, and then trying to bake that in to some extent to the way LeanPub works. But using someone else's process, there's always a bit of a trade-off, right? And if you really want to get things exactly the way you want, you do it your own way. Typically, the sort of LeanPub model would be, while you're writing, don't worry. Try not to worry about formatting. It's kind of impossible, at least if you have mindset like mine. But try not to worry about it. And then when you're done writing, then you do your formatting. And that's actually one of the reasons that we have the Bring Your Own Book writing mode, is that you can actually write in a LeanPub mode, and then when you're done, you can, if you want to, you can actually hand it off to a professional book designer or something like that, and then you can upload the resulting files with the professionally designed and things like that. But yeah, thanks very much for sharing that process. If you ever wrote a blog post about it, I bet you'd get a lot of people interested in hearing about what you did. Well, Marco, actually, I guess it's been about an hour, close to an hour that we've been talking. So just to wrap things up, the last question I always like to ask if the guest has published something on LeanPub is, if there was one magical feature we could build for you, or one terribly annoying thing about LeanPub that we could fix for you, can you think of anything you would ask us other than storing payment information? Can you think of anything that you could ask us to do?
I actually consider that a feature. I've worked at places where payment informations weren't exactly stored in a sensible way. So I'm glad to see, companies not doing that, because then there's no way of screwing up. But yeah, I don't have any major complaints. One thing I remember annoyed me just a tiny bit was the embed feature. So you guys give a chunk of HTML that you can copy paste on your website, and then a widget comes up with information about the book and a button to buy it. And I remember being annoyed because it had a single layout. So it sort of has a vertical layout, if I remember correctly. And I wanted it to be horizontal. Like, I think a vertical layout is really difficult to fit in a traditional web page. So if it had been horizontal, I would probably have put it on my, my website page. This is very, very minor, and there are ways to work around it. But I think it's it's a nice improvement for little effort.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I'll make a task, and we'll discuss it probably actually just later today in our next development meeting, because no promises or anything like that, but actually, not like the moment you mentioned it, it's like, yeah, the sort of vertical embed thing just does seem really kind of like old school, like that's a bit anachronistic now, and people like their 16:9 type
exactly
kind of things. So yeah, well, I'll talk about that with the team today. Thanks very much, Marco, for taking the time out what I'm sure was a beautiful evening in a small town near Milan. And thanks very much for being on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's been great fun.
Thanks. And as always, thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the Front Matter podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate and review it wherever you found it. And if you'd like to be a LeanPub author yourself, please check out our website at leanpub.com. Thanks.